Good day. Today is Wednesday, 15th January 2025. We've had further information about the state of things in Ukraine. We've had further information concerning the former president, or rather, he's still actually the current president of South Korea, who has been arrested in connection with the martial law decree that he made most recklessly some weeks ago. And what I'm going to start this program with, we've had further evidence of growing tensions between President-elect Trump and his team and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Now, this is all unexpected, but the evidence is now mounting and coming together. And there's been some further confirmation of this and more evidence of it from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, which has reported on intense pressure being placed on Israel by Donald Trump and his team to conclude a ceasefire in Gaza before Trump's inauguration. And I think before I proceed, I should say that Haaretz is, of course, a opposition newspaper. It is bitterly opposed to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government. It has a completely different perspective on the sort of policies Israel should be following at this particular time. And there are even reports, which of course I can't confirm, that Prime Minister Netanyahu is so angry altogether with Haaretz that he would like to see the newspaper closed and has been trying to arrange for that to happen. But having said that, I myself have been reading Haaretz alongside other Israeli newspapers, which might be described as pro-government, for some time. I've found Haaretz to be insightful and reliable in terms of the facts that it reports, though its political biases are very clear, and I have no reason to doubt at all that this description of recent events which have taken place is true. So the title of the article, which is in Haaretz, is Trump's Mideast envoy forced Netanyahu to accept a Gaza plan he repeatedly rejected. And then we go on to read, and I'm not going to read the whole article because it's behind a paywall, but I'm going to read what for me are the most interesting parts of it. Anyway, we then go on to read this. Last Friday evening, Stephen Witkoff, US President-elect Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, called from Qatar to tell Prime Minister Netanyahu's aides that he would be coming to Israel the following afternoon. The aides politely explained that was in the middle of the Sabbath, but that the Prime Minister would gladly meet him Saturday night. Witkoff's blunt reaction took them by surprise. He explained to them in salty English, in other words, there were swear words and all that Shabbat was of no interest to him. His message was loud and clear. Thus, in an unusual departure from official practice, the Prime Minister showed up at his office for an official meeting with Witkoff, who then returned to Qatar to seal the deal. Now, the important thing to say here is that though the talk across the media space in the United States and elsewhere is that the Gaza ceasefire that is currently being negotiated and which may be agreed, it's looking likely that it will be agreed, though it has not yet been agreed as of this time, and there's always a possibility that something might go wrong. Anyway, the media space in the United States and elsewhere has been telling us that it is Biden's administration, Biden's team, who have been pushing for this ceasefire in Gaza. Haaretz, and by the way, the story is also being reported elsewhere in the Israeli media, though not quite in these stark terms. Anyway, Haaretz tells us otherwise. The pressure to conclude the ceasefire deal now is coming from Donald Trump, from the incoming administration, not the outgoing one. Stephen Witkoff is Trump's envoy. He is not Biden's, and he was in Qatar, in Doha to be precise, where the Gaza ceasefire negotiations have been underway. And most remarkably, it appears that he has been directly involved in them, even though, as of today, as of the time when all these events took place, last Friday, he was technically still a private citizen. Just saying. Anyway, the article from Haaretz goes on to say, a week before Trump's inauguration, Jerusalem already sees a change in the rules of the game that has broken the deadlock in the hostage negotiations. Unusually, the outgoing Biden administration has let Witkoff lead the process. So it's Witkoff who is in charge. The Biden people, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, all of their various people, they've been pushed aside. Unusually, the outgoing Biden administration has let Witkoff lead the process on the grounds that any obligations the United States undertakes will be incumbent on Trump, not on Biden. All very true, but of course, in relation to matters connected to Ukraine, we see that the Biden administration has taken a completely different approach. But anyway, let's not dwell on that. Trump and his people have pushed the Biden people aside. They've already taken control of the negotiations in Doha to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza, and they are pushing the Israelis hard. We're then told that Witkoff is a Jewish real estate investor and developer who is close to Trump. In other words, he is a friend of Trump's and they work in the same business as each other. He doesn't have the background of the kind of people who usually fill diplomatic roles. Witkoff isn't a diplomat. He doesn't talk like a diplomat. He has no interest in diplomatic manners and diplomatic protocols, says a senior Israeli diplomat who spoke on condition of anonymity. He is a businessman who wants to reach a deal quickly and charges ahead unusually aggressively. And that, of course, is also true of Donald Trump himself. Now, I would say, by the way, that when it comes to using salty language, I am pretty sure that Trump is perfectly capable of doing the same. And I've no doubt that he has done that on many occasions in the many business deals that he has contracted, and I suspect it's pretty common in the real estate and construction industry, in both of which both Witkoff and Trump are, of course, that's where they made their money. That's where they made their business. And then we go on to read this. In fact, Witkoff has forced Israel to accept a plan that Netanyahu has repeatedly rejected over the past half year. And here we come back to a point that I have recently made, both in programs on this channel and in programs on the Duran. Indeed, we recently did a program on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and myself, looking at this very topic, in which I made the point, in which we've made the point, that if the contours of the deal that we are hearing about, the deal that will underpin this Gaza ceasefire, are true, then this deal was certainly there for the taking. Well, Haaretz says for 6 months. My own view is for at least a year. This deal could have been agreed a year ago, saving tens of thousands of lives and a huge amount of destruction, sparing Israel massive international embarrassment, probably preventing the court cases in The Hague taking off and gathering the momentum that they have, and also avoiding the enormous damage that's been done to the Israeli economy and the risks of an outright war between Israel and Iran. So the fact that there's been so much time taken to achieve this deal tells us what has been lost as a result of that delay, and I'm afraid it shifts the burden of responsibility back on Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet, obviously, but also on President Biden and his administration for allowing this whole awful tragedy to play out in the way that it has for so much longer than it now seems it needed to do. Anyway, let's move on. This is what Haaretz then goes on to say. Hamas has not budged from its position that the hostages' freedom must be conditioned on the release of Palestinian prisoners. And all of the reports say that that is indeed going to happen. But also a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And that might still be a sticking point. Netanyahu rejected this condition, and thus was born the partial deal proposed by Egypt. Initially, the talk was of a limited humanitarian deal. More and more conditions were slowly appended until it grew into a much bigger proposal with clear outlines, a hostage release, new regional arrangements, and full withdrawal. The Philadelphia corridor, which Netanyahu last summer termed the bedrock of Israel's existence, is part of the deal. At Egypt's request, Israel will fully withdraw from it in the first phase. So there is to be a staged withdrawal by Israel from Gaza. At least that's the deal. Of course, deals can be made in the Middle East and they don't necessarily happen, or at least they're not enforced. Sometimes people agree to do things in the Middle East and they don't do them. And that's also possible. But I'm talking about the makings of the deal now. And it looks as if all of the various elements of it have been in place. Hamas has not made any concessions on the substance, on the principle of an Israeli withdrawal, but has been pushed into making significant concessions about having the withdrawal take place in a phased way. And gradually, step by step, the Israelis have appeared to agree to this, except up to this point, they've resisted. They've always come back, always asked for more. There's always been new conditions set, new demands. The Israelis appear to agree one day and then reverse their position and demand more the next. So that's been the process up to now. But Haaretz is telling us that after Witkoff stepped in, after Trump started to apply the pressure, this has now changed. And we're told that this time it's for real, that Netanyahu really does feel that he's been put in a position where he has no real choice but to go along with what Trump is demanding, because Trump has the force of personality and the political authority in the United States to make this stick. Well, we shall see. But then the article goes on to say it's hard to know how Netanyahu feels about this aggressive behavior. While it provides an excuse he can give to his base, he may resent being dragged into an unwanted deal that will end the war and possibly lead to political upheaval at home. And that's the point. That the most important thing here is not whether this deal sticks. I think more likely than not it will. There's already been some statements by some Trump officials that Hamas has no right to exist and all of that. And some are seeing this as evidence that the Trump people are actually themselves reconsidering this deal. But it's important to stress it's what Trump himself says, that really matters in on these questions. And he publicly, at least, continues to say nothing. And one does get the impression that Witkoff is acting very much on Trump's behalf. And Witkoff clearly wants to see the deal done. And one must assume that Witkoff is acting in accordance with Trump's wishes. But put that aside, what this tells us is that relations between Trump and Netanyahu are not good. And then the article from Haaretz confirms this. Netanyahu's propaganda machine is pushing the no-choice narrative that it's Trump, On Monday, laments began to be heard on Channel 14 that Trump isn't what we thought. I'm surprised all the senior officials in the US administration are saying the same thing, Yotam Zimri said on the Patriots program. If this doesn't happen by the time Trump comes in, Hamas will understand what hell is. I don't understand the Israeli interest in at least not waiting for Trump, Yinon Magal answered. And then the reply came, it's because Trump is pressing to do it. That's what's happening. And then Zimri comes back. So all his people have been lying. It's a big disappointment. And then Magal answers. He talks about hell and in the meantime sends his envoy to sign a deal. It's a deal whose impact will be very difficult. That's the truth. Magal added that the last remaining hope is that Hamas will reject the deal. A cabinet minister told me we need to pray again that God will harden Pharaoh's heart. And then we go on to read that on Monday morning, another Netanyahu mouthpiece, Jacob Bardugo, said, the pressure Trump is exerting right now is not the kind that Israel expected from him. The pressure is the essence of the matter. Well, as I said, let's not, pull out any champagne corks. Nothing has been agreed so far. It could be that this all falls apart at the last moment, as so many Gaza deals have done. But the Israelis, or at least people close to Netanyahu, are complaining that Donald Trump is putting pressure on them at a level that they did not expect to get the deal on Gaza signed and sealed. And they don't like it, and they're saying that this is not what Trump led them to expect. I'm going to make my own guess. I think the pressure from Trump on the Israelis is going to continue, and it will intensify. All of the comments that we've been hearing from the Trump people about Hamas getting hell if it doesn't agree, and about Hamas having no right to any existence, are statements being made by Trump and his people to reassure his base that his underlying stance on Israel and the Middle East is unchanged, notwithstanding that he has been piling on all of this pressure. Now, I have to say, pressure, verbal pressure is one thing, salty language is one thing, turning up in Netanyahu's office on the Sabbath is one thing, Shabbat is one thing. What does it all amount to in fact? Is Trump prepared to walk back deliveries of weapons to Israel? Is he prepared to slow down economic support for Israel? Is he prepared to interrupt intelligence cooperation with Israel if the Israelis don't comply? Netanyahu has repeatedly shown that he has the ability to absorb damage, to absorb criticism and words, and still press forward with his policies. This article from Haaretz that I've mentioned says that Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, the leader of the extreme hardliners within the Israeli cabinet, is already saying that this deal is catastrophic, though it's not clear whether he will pull out of the government if it is implemented. So there continues to be opposition, and it may be that opposition from the hardliners within Israel is of more concern in the end to Netanyahu than any verbal pressure, however saltily it is expressed by Donald Trump and his officials. But then again, the fact that Netanyahu is apparently saying that he has no choice ultimately but to agree this deal, that may suggest a different story. After all, looked at objectively, Israel currently is in a weak position. It has fought a war in southern Lebanon. It failed to capture any villages. It bombed Beirut heavily. It killed large numbers of Hezbollah fighters, but Hezbollah is still there. It decapitated Hezbollah's leadership, but Hezbollah's leadership has been replaced. It's now got another problem on its hands in Syria, where it's seeing rising tensions with Turkey. The fall of the Assad government might not have been the straightforward gift that some people in Israel perhaps hoped. And in Gaza itself, the Wall Street Journal is repeating what the Israeli media are saying, that after absorbing repeated blows, Hamas is reconstituting itself, it's recruiting more fighters, it's rearming. Presumably the workshops that produce weapons for Hamas within Gaza still function. It now has a new leadership led by Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of the man that Israel killed. So, and of course, there's been pressures on the Israeli economy. It has been in recession. I understand that few people so far have actually returned to their homes in northern Israel. And of course, Netanyahu himself is the subject of an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. There are proceedings against him and Yoav Gallant, his former defense minister, underway in the International Criminal Court. And there is also a pending and in some ways much more serious case underway against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Now, all of these problems, maybe each one by itself, would not present many great difficulties for Israel. But cumulatively, it does look as if this is a big set of unresolved issues. And one could argue, perhaps rightly, that Israel is under greater pressure than it has been at any time, arguably, since the 1973 war. So in a situation like this, Israel itself, and perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, may feel that they're not in a position to defy the incoming president of the United States, when he is known to be a fiery personality of the sort that Donald Trump is. So, well, we'll see how it all works out. But that there are tensions between Netanyahu and Trump, between Israel and the future administration of the United States, that, it seems to me, is now undeniable. I'm going to say something else here, and that this is once again confirms a lot of the reporting that we've done, or at least analysis that we've done on the Duran. We said back in August that Benjamin Netanyahu was making the most of the power vacuum in Washington caused by the decision of Joe Biden to step down from standing as a candidate in the November election. We also said that once the election was underway, it could be that that window of opportunity, which Netanyahu was exploiting might begin to close. We also said that it was more likely to close if Trump, the stronger personality, was elected president, as against Kamala Harris, who is ultimately a continuation of an administration that has proved completely ineffectual. And, well, we see in this article in Haaretz, in the various other things that are happening, increasing signs that this is so. Now, here perhaps we come back to not just the situation in Gaza, the situation in the Middle East as a whole. I discussed in a recent program how it looked to me as if the attempts by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government to persuade the United States, be it under President Biden following the election or President-elect Trump, to agree to a missile and bombing offensive against Iran, that all of that has come to a juddering stop. Trump is opposed. Biden is not in a position, realistically, where he can agree to it. And for that reason, it is increasingly looking as if, for the moment at least, it won't happen. Now, I've said that for the Israelis and for their friends, my guess was that the cause of urgency was the strategic partnership agreement that Russia and Iran would sign in Moscow on the 17th of January. And in fact, we have now obtained more information about this strategic partnership agreement. It is 47 clauses long, and from what I can see, it is identical to what I had been told by the source that had been providing me with information, basically provided, circulating within the Russian parliament itself. This is, by the way, I should stress, by no means confidential or classified information. It's basically up there on the post board. You MPs go in and get this information. It's available to them. It's not fully open access, but neither is it classified. Anyway, the information that the Russian parliamentarians were getting, which my source then forwarded to me, appears to be identical with the actual agreement, partnership agreement, that the Iranians and the Russians are about to sign. Now, both countries, both Russia and Iran, have been making statements over the last 24 hours that this is a partnership agreement between these two countries, that it is in no way directed or intended to threaten any third countries. Certainly, it is not intending to threaten Saudi Arabia, which is now on reasonably good terms with Iran, and obviously, it is not intended to threaten Israel. The Russians have repeatedly made clear that they are not a party to the wider Arab-Israeli conflict, or, by the way, to the Iranian-Israeli conflict. They're not overtly taking sides in that conflict. But when you read the commentaries that have been appearing in the Russian media, and, by the way, the Iranian media, about this partnership agreement, it turns out that many of the security clauses that I believed, was told exist, actually do exist, and we are only looking at the surface. It does seem that there is a security dimension to this agreement, and I believe that the reports that Russia is going to assist Iran to build up its air defense system are true, and I believe that it is almost certainly correct that the newly recreated Iranian air defense system will indeed be integrated with the Russian air defense system, at least to some degree. Now, that will not happen tomorrow or next week or in a year's time. This is going to be the work of several years. But once it is completed, assuming that nothing has happened to interrupt it in the interim, then my guess is that Iran will have become once and for all too difficult a target to attack. And at that point, hopefully, the Iranians will make a decision that there is no further purpose in even contemplating or reserving to themselves the possibility of developing a nuclear bomb, in which case not only will Iran publicly eschew that idea, which it has always done, but it could also wrap up and close down its entire enrichment program, which has been the issue around which all the concerns have been raised. So there we are. That is where I think we're heading. Now, all of that might sound like, in some ways, good news for the Middle East, for the world, even for Israel, and I think it is. If the Iranians are no longer too weak to resist a missile or air attack upon them, if that period of weakness has ended, if they're too strong in future for that to happen, and if they have no need any longer to enrich uranium, even as a possible threat to provide some kind of leverage over the United States and Israel and other countries, well, you might have thought, you might say, and I certainly do say, that is not only unequivocally good news, it's actually good news for Israel itself. I do not think it is in Israel's interests to get drawn into a long war with Iran. And of course, if the purported threat of a nuclear-armed Iran is indeed the existential threat to Israel that the Israelis themselves believe, then an agreement between Russia and Iran, which makes that threat of a nuclear-armed Iran go away, ought to be something that Israel logically should welcome. But that is, of course, to look at this from a certain perspective, which Prime Minister Netanyahu himself and the hardliners around him, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir and the others, might not share. Because they will see all of this as doing two quite different things. Firstly, taking away the pretext they have always used in their constant agitation for an attack on Iran, something they have always hankered for, not because Iran is a nuclear-armed state or one that will become nuclear-armed in any proximate period of time, but because it is a powerful state that resists politically and to some extent strategically Israeli goals in the Middle East. And secondly, of course, because it denies Israel the capability to launch that attack on Iran that Smotrich, Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu have always hankered for. So, from the perspective of these people, what might be seen as good news by most people, including most people in Israel, is bad news because it takes both the pretext and the opportunity away from them to do that which they have always wanted to do. So one can understand why the prospect of this strategic partnership between Russia and Iran is alarming to them and why they've been pushing for it so hard. So the fact that Donald Trump, for the moment, appears to be saying no is an important fact, And it could be that the door on the possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran from this moment forward is going to start to close. Just so. Anyway, there it is. There is friction between Trump and Netanyahu. I don't think there's any doubt about this. There is pressure from Trump on Netanyahu. It does not mean that there's going to be peace in the Middle East tomorrow. It does not guarantee that there's going to be a ceasefire in Gaza agreed over the next few days. It does not guarantee that if there is such a ceasefire agreed, that the ceasefire will hold. And it does not avert the danger of a war between Israel and Iran. But it does appear to make the likelihood of a ceasefire in Gaza much more likely than it otherwise was. And it does seem as if, for the moment at least, the plans that were clearly building up over the course of last year for an attack on Iran have been blocked. Increasingly, in more ways than one, it does look as if in foreign policy matters, the election of Donald Trump in November is starting to make a difference. Now let's turn to that other big conflict, which is the one in Ukraine. Now Bloomberg has just published a piece which says that Donald Trump fundamentally is uninterested in Ukraine. He does not consider Ukraine to be an area of great importance or strategic interest for the United States. He wants basically to see the entire problem of Ukraine go away. And by the way, I think that is an accurate summary of his private views. It's not, of course, what he has said in public, but I think that is basically what he thinks and believes. He wants to find some means to close this conflict down so that he can focus on other things. But he wants it to happen in a way that if there is a debacle in Ukraine, the blame is not placed on him, but on his predecessor, Joe Biden, who created the problem in the first place. And if he possibly can, well, obviously he would rather have a better deal with the Russians than a bad one. But as he admitted yesterday, as I discussed in my program yesterday, he has shown that he understands that ultimately it is up to Vladimir Putin, that he only has limited leverage over Putin, that he can't force Putin to his view, that Putin's armies, the Russian armies, are advancing on the Ukrainian battlefields, and that there's only a limited amount that the United States can do to slow that process, and that the United States cannot reverse that process. And as for the Europeans, they are basically hopeless and can be ignored as a factor in this matter, at least in those terms. Now, there continue to be arguments and discussions within the Trump team about how to move forward with this. There's been another article today in Reuters which speaks of some Trump advisors still arguing for some kind of Korean armistice plan or German division plan, a situation where the Russians keep what they have, though the United States doesn't recognize it, that buffer zones are created between the competing armies, and where the Europeans send a big peacekeeping force to Ukraine. Now, the Russians have already said no. They made it absolutely clear that they are not going to agree to that, as I discussed in my program yesterday. The Medvedev, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, has again explicitly ruled out anything that in any way resembles this. Buffer zones, freezing of conflicts, anything of that kind. They've said that they won't agree, and that Medvedev said anything like the German situation of the post-war period is obviously excluded, and that the Russians will never agree to anything like that. And I think Donald Trump is very quickly going to find out that that is the case. Now, yesterday, Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's former national security advisor, someone who is still a member of the Russian Security Council, who, by the way, now supervises Russia's shipbuilding industry. Not a minor post, by the way. The Russians have very, very big ambitions and a very advanced program to rebuild their shipping fleets. Just saying. But anyway, Patrushev, who continues to be close to Putin and who probably still advises him, at least to some degree, on security matters, has now also come forward and expressed a view which I have expressed previously, which is that certainly at the summit meeting, the forthcoming summit meeting between Putin and Trump, it needs to be conducted in a purely bilateral way. And for the moment at least, any talks on Ukraine, on the subject, on the topic of Ukraine, between Russia and the United States, that those talks should be conducted exclusively between the Russians and the Americans, that the Europeans should not be involved, and of course neither should the Ukrainians be. Now that would be an extremely controversial position for the United States. That might be a very, very difficult thing for the Americans to agree to. The Europeans would be deeply unhappy, and by the way, so will the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are going to express themselves in extremely fierce terms about this. But to be frank, if we are actually looking at some kind of a deal, a negotiation, I think that this is probably, at least for the beginning, at the outset, the only way forward. Anatol Lieven has already written a piece on responsible statecraft, saying that in any negotiations to end the conflict, it's better if the Ukrainians are kept away. They will only work to spoil the course of the negotiations. And I'm going to say it frankly, I think that if the Europeans are involved, at least for the moment, with people like Ursula von der Leyen still in charge of the European Commission, with incredibly extreme positions being taken by the Baltic states, the Scandinavians, at times the Poles, though the Poles sometimes say other things too, by various political factions in Germany, by Friedrich Merz, at times by Emmanuel Macron, by the British. If these extreme hardliners are involved in the negotiations, I can't really see how the negotiations are going to be able to get anywhere at all. For the moment, at least, for the first couple of weeks and months, it's better if the Russians and the Americans talk to each other alone, if only with a view to achieving some kind of understanding of each other's positions. And only then, when that has been done, and whether when they have perhaps some kind of a framework that they can work with in order to move forward. Only at that point might it be a good idea to start broadening the talks to involve others. Except, of course, I do understand, and I'm going to say, in fact, further later in the program, that the time for all of this might actually be relatively short. But there it is. I think that negotiations with any other parties other than the Americans and the Russians at this point in time are not going to succeed. And I think this Patrushev is right. Now, Patrushev has said more. He's also said that it's far from certain that Ukraine will survive as a state beyond 2025. The fact that, these are his words, the fact that the forced conversion to the ideology of the 1930s, obviously, he used stronger language than I've just done, and fervent Russophobia eliminate Ukrainian cities that used to flourish, including Kharkiv, Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, is particularly alarming. It is not ruled out that Ukraine will completely cease to exist this year. That's what Patrushev said, that this kind of attempt to extinguish everything Russian in these cities which ultimately used to be, or used to conceive of themselves as Russian, puts in question the entire viability of the state of the state of Ukraine. And notice that he's now providing an admittedly very soft timeline. He's saying that 2025 might be the year when Ukraine ceases to exist. And of course, he's saying all of that in connection with the continued Russian advance that's continuing to take place in Ukraine. That the Ukrainian army is now close to breakdown, and that opens up the possibility that the Russians might, in fact, conclude that there is really nothing further to discuss about Ukraine because Ukraine is going to cease to exist. Now, Patrushev may be saying this, again, in order to gain leverage over the Americans, telling the Americans, look, you don't have an unlimited amount of time. You must come to an agreement with us as fast as possible, because with every day that the war continues, not only do we move further west, but there is a real possibility that Ukraine, the country that you are seeking to preserve, might cease to exist. It could be, as I said, a position that the Russians are taking in negotiations. But given the realities on the Ukrainian battlefields, I think that might be an unwise and indeed reckless thing. Now, here I'm going to say something about the realities on the Ukrainian battlefields. Yesterday, I was discussing in my program the massive Ukrainian drone strike and missile strike, combined drone and missile strike on Russia. And I said that it had achieved very little. Well, over the following hours, the Russian Defense Ministry provided further information about this missile and drone strike, and they confirmed that the missile strike on Bryansk region involved ATACMS missiles, but also, it turns out, 6 Storm Shadow missiles. And in fact, 2 Storm Shadow missiles were used in other places as well. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry said about this. Last night, That's to say, not last night, but the night before last. The Ukrainian military launched a massive strike at objects in Bryansk region by 6 US-made ATACMS, operational tactical missiles, 6 British-made Storm Shadow air-based cruise missiles, and 31 fixed-wing unmanned aerial vehicles from the territory of Ukraine. During the air defense battle, all air attack means were shot down by air defense crews. There were no casualties or wounded as a result of the attack. In addition, 2 British-made Storm Shadow air-based cruise missiles were shot down over the Black Sea. These actions of the Kiev regime, supported by Western curators, will not go unanswered. That's what the Russian Defense Ministry said late yesterday about the attack on the previous day. Now, I'm going to say straight away that this, if true, and all of the evidence suggests that the Russian Defense Ministry, in their account of this attack, are indeed telling us the truth. If this is true, then this is a catalogue of, I would say, disastrous failure. 6 advanced and expensive ATACMS missiles in short supply. 6 perhaps even more expensive and even more advanced Storm Shadow cruise missiles. These are supposed to be stealthy and difficult to shoot down. Also shot down over Bryansk region. Another 2 Storm Shadows launched at targets in the Black Sea. It'd be interesting to know which targets. Also shot down 14 missiles, ATACMS and Storm Shadows shot down over the course of a single night. And it appears that all of the other drones, that they were all shot down as well. Nothing was achieved as a result of these attacks. That decision by the Biden administration back in April, executed from November, to authorize missile strikes against Russia. Well, as I've already said, what it has done is showcase Russian air defense capabilities. It means that the Russians are now able to shoot down these missiles, and apparently these missiles are not able in any significant number to get through. Now, the Russians responded last night. At least, maybe they didn't respond. We never know. We can never be sure how carefully prepared Russian missile strikes are. My own sense is that the Russians, when the Russians do engage in missile strikes against Ukraine, mass missile strikes, they do so with weeks of preparation. So it's likely that the strike last night, which is a big one, is unconnected with the Ukrainian strike on the previous day. Though I have seen some suggestions that the Ukrainian strike was intended to preempt the Russian one. But that aside, last night the Russians also carried out a huge combined missile and drone strike across Ukraine. Now we're getting sporadic details as we speak of what this strike achieved. We don't have all of the information yet. I'll probably return to this topic tomorrow. But already there are reports of blackouts and power interruptions across Ukraine, that it looks as if at least some of these missiles, probably many of these missiles, got through and struck their targets, and that the Ukrainian air defense and energy complex, which appear to be the main targets, have indeed been significantly affected by these strikes. What we see again is another illustration of a point I have been making many times. Brian Beletic, by the way, makes it also. When the Ukrainians launch strikes, it may attract a great deal of media attention. But nothing of any significance is ever achieved when the Russians launch strikes with far greater quantities of missiles and drones. Vastly more damage is done against an already much weaker country, and the impact is huge. There is this enormous discrepancy in power, and these attempts by Ukraine to try to respond to Russian attacks in this way, by taking the battle, as they would say, to Russian territory, all it does is emphasize not just the Ukrainians' limitations in terms of technology and capability, but that of their Western backers as well. Anyway, on the battlefronts, and I'm going to be very brief today, we've had a lot of news over the last 24 hours from Chasiv Yar. It looks as if the battle for Chasiv Yar is about to end. It looks as if the last Ukrainian resistance has been broken. The Russians have recaptured the industrial center, the refractory plant. They've pushed the Ukrainians out. They're apparently now storming the buildings, the high-rise buildings just to the south of this area. But the Ukrainian troops there are cut off. All of that I mentioned in my program yesterday. But this morning, there was reports that the Russians have also recaptured the Novi micro-district. I believe that means that the Russians now control roughly 60% of Chasiv Yar. And the other parts of Chasiv Yar, of which the Ukrainians retain some degree of tenuous control, are apparently much more difficult to defend. And the Russians have fire control over all of the main supply lines. Their drones are operating above the roads. It looks as if any attempt by the Ukrainians to send supplies into Chasiv Yar, in most cases, the supplies simply don't get through. So the Battle of Chasiv Yar now, it looks like, is conclusively coming to an end. There have also been further film about the situation in Toretsk. And it's very interesting in Toretsk because most of the city, about 98% of the city in the various maps, is shown as being under Russian control. There are still one or two grey areas which are supposed to be contested. And then every day or so, pictures appear which show Russian troops in precisely those grey areas. And every single day, over the last couple of days, as far as I can see, the remaining grey areas, which are fairly small, are painted as being under Russian control. My own view is that the Russians control all of Toretsk, all of the residential areas of Toretsk. I think that there are still some Ukrainian troops in a coal mine to the northeast of Toretsk. That coal mine still needs to be cleared. I think the Ukrainian troops who are in that coal mine are effectively trapped, and I think that's the only reason why there is still fighting going on there. It is very much like the situation in Kurakovo. The Russians captured all of the residential area of Kurakovo before they were able to capture the thermal power station and the metallurgical plant to the west of Kurakovo, but ultimately they were able to do so with little difficulty. So the Battle of Toretsk, I think, is to all intents and purposes over. The Battle of Chasiv Yar soon will be over. And there's been more reports of more Russian advances in the Pokrovsk area. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the entire territory of Peshania is under Russian control. That means, by the way, that the famous mine close to Pokrovsk that produces coking coal for the Ukrainian steel industry. It's located so close to this battlefield area that it has now had to stop completely all production. And of course, the Russians a few days ago captured Shevchenko, west of Selidovo, bringing Europe's biggest known deposit of lithium fully under their control. And there are reports this morning that the Russians have broken deeper into Velikaya Novosilka. Our old friend Vladimir Rogov has been telling the Russian media that the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka are encircled, that they're in a cauldron. Actually, the word that he uses, that they are basically marooned on an island. He's talking figuratively. What he means is that they're encircled, that their only real option now is either to surrender en masse or to go on fighting until they're all destroyed. So anyway, it looks as if all of these battles are heading closer and closer to an end. And going back to a point I've made in these programs before, once Pokrovsk, Velikaya Novosilka, all of these places fall under Russian control, not only do the Russians have an open route to the Dnieper, and going back to Patrushev, he too now appears to be talking about the Russians advancing to the Dnieper itself. He pointedly reminded people in the same interview that the Russians are within 6 kilometers of Dnipro region, the boundaries of Dnipro region, so that they are poised, in effect, to move into Dnipro region and to push towards the river. And remember what he was talking about the collapse of Ukraine in 2025. I'm going to come to the implications of that shortly. Anyway, the point is that once these remaining places are captured, there is no barrier for a further westward advance, no fortified barrier for a further westward advance by the Russians until they reach the Dnieper River itself. And as to what fortifications, if any, the Ukrainians have on the west bank of the Dnieper River, one can only speculate. I've heard many contradictory stories about this. But, and this is the key point, and this is where I think there is the sting in Patrushev's words. I have repeatedly said that if the Russians reach the Dnieper in central Ukraine, if indeed the whole of eastern Ukraine, extending all the way north to Kharkiv and all of these other places, pass under Russian control, then the Ukrainian state, as we have known it, no longer becomes viable. That the Dnieper is not a natural border, that should be understood instead as an artery. Many people have pointed out now that without proper hydraulic controls, the entire floodplain of the Dnieper would become unmanageable, and that this would affect the impact of any cities located on it. I'm not going to get into that discussion, about which I know very little. But that, it seems to me, is what Patrushev might have in mind. He may be saying, look, and this is, as I said, it may not just be a message to the Americans. What he may be saying is, look, we are close to a breakthrough. Our forces will be on the Dnieper fairly soon. Beyond that, Ukraine becomes economically unviable, and we will start to see the cumulative unraveling of the Ukrainian state and its collapse, final collapse, over the course of 2025. Well, there it is. Now, let's turn to other and related matters. Let me first of all say that there are increasing signs that even some of the most extreme hardliners are in the West are beginning to understand that the war in Ukraine is lost. Now, I say that because the former British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, Boris Johnson's ally and friend, and the man who played an instrumental role in organising military support for Ukraine in 2022 and 2023, has written one of the most bitter and angry and extreme articles in the Daily Telegraph that I have ever seen. To get a sense of how bitter it is, consider the title. Obviously, this title will not have been picked by Ben Wallace, but as we will see, it reflects not just sentiment, but actual words that he uses in the article itself. The title is, "We must put Russia in a prison and build the walls high." Russia, the whole country, the world's biggest country, a country of 150 million plus people, must be basically put in a prison. And he makes it very clear that he is blaming the Russian people, not just Vladimir Putin, for the fact that the war in Ukraine is about to be lost by the West. Well, the past 3 years have shown that the criminal and fascist regime, he's talking about Putin's, goes way beyond a few bitter old KGB men. It turns out that the Russians not only support the invasion, the Russians, he means the people of Russia, but they support the use of torture, mass murder, assassinations, and cyber attacks. As with Germany in the Second World War, Russia's actions are only possible because of widespread support amongst its citizens. One of the features of the Soviet Union was the hundreds of Russian dissidents who bravely spoke out or campaigned from exile. This time around, the numbers who do so are in single figures. A very interesting admission, by the way. Just saying. Most Russians abroad in the United Arab Emirates, Cyprus, or the capitals of Europe believe Putin is correct while shielding their sons from being drafted to Ukraine. The last, of course, an entirely gratuitous comment. There is no draft in Russia of the kind that Ben Wallace is talking about. As I am sure he knows, the Russian army is expanding its forces in Ukraine through voluntary recruitment, not through a draft. Put that aside. And then he goes on to say this. So what is to be done with this gangster state? Well, I believe that just like other gangsters, Russia, he means the country, belongs behind bars, prison bars of its own making. At the moment, despite sanctions, Russia acts as if nothing has happened. Our Western capitals and private schools are still full of wealthy Putin supporters. I wonder whether that's true, but anyway. Russia operates a shadow fleet of ships that enable it to export oil, cuts cables and smuggles goods. Famous British brands are still being sold in Moscow, brands we ought to consider taking action against. So in 2025, we should make sure the West starts building the prison walls high. We should patch the holes and lock the doors. We should use our collective diplomacy to pressure places such as Cyprus, the US, UAE, and Switzerland, of course the UAE is a member of BRICS, to clamp down on the playgrounds of the Russian elite. Just as we remove criminals from society, so we should do the same to Russia. Well, there it is. That is Ben Wallace. An entire nation, an entire country, according to him, should be, metaphorically speaking, be put behind bars. Why is he writing in this way? Because he can see that in Ukraine, the writing is on the wall, and his anger and bitterness are spilling over. We're going to get an awful lot more of this, I'm afraid, over the next couple of weeks. A couple of weeks ago, in fact, The Guardian also published an article by a Ukrainian intellectual, which also said that everything Russian, ballet, music, whatever, also needed to be pushed out of the West, at least of Britain, that there should be nothing Russian left at all. Well, that was a Ukrainian, and of course it is his country which is at war, and up to a certain point, I can understand why he would take that view, though I still found it bizarre that The Guardian should republish such a piece. But this piece by Ben Wallace is not written by an embittered Ukrainian who is seeing his country go down in a long and bitter war. It is written by a former British politician who was once Britain's defence secretary. As I said, it gives you a sense of the anger and the bitterness which is now spilling over. Well, it is not an anger and bitterness that everybody in Europe or indeed in Britain shares. Now, if we're talking about Britain, we are obviously in deepening economic difficulties. I've already discussed them. I've also discussed how the rises in energy costs are making those difficulties greater. The government has tried to make the most of a surprise announcement of a marginal fall in inflation over the previous month. I think that far from that being a good sign, it is on the contrary a bad sign. It is a sign, a further sign, that Britain is falling into recession and the demand is collapsing, so that suppliers of consumer goods to the British domestic market are being forced to slash prices. So it's far from a good sign. On the contrary, it is a very bad sign. But at least in Britain, well, for historic reasons, we are an orderly and law-abiding people. And though we do protest at times, we always protest in a quiet way, at least compared to what you see in some other places. We don't yet have in British politics the drama that Alice Weidel and the AfD have brought to German politics, for example, or the drama that we might see in French politics before long as well. But in Romania, it's already different. There, as a result of a decision which I still find astonishing, I still find completely incredible, as something which, by the way, if you told me it would happen 10 years ago, I would never have believed it. Well, what we had in Romania was not, as some people say, the postponement of elections or the cancellation of elections. We actually had the annulment of an election result. An election result in which, after careful recounts, it was confirmed that there was no rigging and that the candidate who won the first round in the presidential election actually did win that election. Nonetheless, the result was annulled, and as of today, no new elections have been called. The former president remains the acting president. I say the former president. The current president remains the acting president. There is no date or time when the new elections will be called by. We don't know when that is ever going to happen. The president, therefore, the current president, Mr. Iohannis, can look forward to an apparently indefinite stay in office. Obviously, again, I'm overstating things. Presumably, at some point, an election will be called. Moreover, it's becoming increasingly clear that the premise upon which the election was annulled, at least the supposed premise upon which the election was annulled, that the intelligence agencies had obtained information that there'd been an orchestrated campaign, orchestrated by Moscow on TikTok to push votes to the candidate who won the first round, Mr. Georgievsky. Well, it's increasingly looking as if that was wrong. There was a TikTok campaign, but it seems it probably wasn't organized by the Russians. I don't myself, by the way, just to quickly say, think that a TikTok campaign organized by anybody is a reason to call off the first round of an election. As I have previously pointed out, if you're unhappy with the results of the first round of an election, you don't simply annul the results. You campaign in the second round, pointing out what happened in the first round and calling on people to adjust their vote, taking that fact into account. Anyway, the premise that, as I said, the Russians orchestrated a campaign on TikTok and that supposedly contaminated the electoral process, leading in some bizarre and unexplained way to a reason to annul the entire election. Anyway, the facts for that are beginning to look very threadbare indeed, and maybe I am being polite here. It's increasingly looking as if, to the extent that there was a campaign on behalf of Mr. Georgievsky on TikTok, it was not organized by the Russians at all, but by another rival party in Romania, which was talking up Mr. Georgievsky through these TikTok videos in order to drain support away from one of its more liberal rivals in Romanian domestic politics, about which, by the way, I know very little. Anyway, the fact is, an election was annulled, an astonishing decision, and there is no sign yet of new elections being called. There's been reports that they might happen in April or in May. Nobody can say. There's open discussion about whether Mr. Georgievsky himself will be allowed to stand. I am completely unable to understand on what basis he's going to be prevented from standing. Anyway, the result is Romania finds itself in this dangerous limbo, and it is dangerous. There are growing doubts, and we have seen the first big protests. Now, they've taken place in Bucharest, and according to, I believe it was The Guardian, they attracted a wide cross-section of Romanian society. People on the left, as well as on the right, came out to protest what has happened to the first round of the election. They're saying that the annulment, authorized by the Constitutional Court, and then reaffirmed by the Constitutional Court, notwithstanding, as I said, that the evidence that led to the first wrong decision is now looking fragile. Anyway, the annulment of the election has provoked alarm amongst people right across the political spectrum in Romania. I read a comment in this article from a Romanian woman who was participating in these protests, who was in fact aligned, as far as I could see, in the left, who was saying that we're moving in Romania to a situation where instead of us electing our leaders, we're going back to how it once was, during presumably the communist era, when our leaders were picked for us. And so we had the first protests. Now, these protests involved apparently tens of thousands of people. The protesters themselves say that 100,000 people turned up. The police put it at much less, at just 20,000. But I have no doubt that these protests, if this limbo continues, will grow. I think the anger is growing in Romania. And by the way, I've noticed that Mr. Gheorghescu's poll rating is now gradually rising, and I believe it's well over 40%, and it's increasingly looking as if he would win a convincing victory in the election, in the presidential election, were he to be allowed to stand. Just saying. So, what has happened in Romania? What is happening in Romania, I expect is going to start happening elsewhere in Europe as well. People like Ben Wallace are going to have even more reasons before long to be angry, because my sense is that more and more people across Europe increasingly are not agreeing with them. They're concerned about other things, about energy costs. We were told, for example, after the Biden sanctions were imposed, that this would only lead to a small upward blip in energy prices. We were told that the decision by Zelensky, backed by the European Union, to stop transit of Russian gas across Ukraine would have no significant effect on energy prices in Europe. We now have an energy crisis developing in Europe. I said that I could not understand how, at a time when there were already existing shortages in supply of gas in Europe, the cut-off of 5% of the gas to Europe, the 5% that passed from Russia to Europe across Ukraine, how that the loss of that 5% could not have an effect on energy prices. Things are now becoming so bad that even the ultra-loyalist pro-EU Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. Mitsotakis, has written a letter to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen saying that the European Union needs to take urgent steps to deal with the growth, the rises in energy costs. He doesn't propose solutions. He says that we need to think of creative ways in order to deal with this problem. An indication of the political pressures he is in Greece itself, as the energy costs grow and put Greek businesses under pressure and Greek consumers under pressure, but also of the complete barrenness of his thinking, his lack of any ideas about what to do in this situation, which of course reflects that of the entire European political class. Well, all of this, the bitterness that we see in Ben Wallace's article, the empty talk from Mitsotakis and from other European leaders, the bizarre events in Romania, what they, I think, reinforce is Patrushev's point that, for the moment at least, it is better that the Americans and the Russians talk about Ukraine with each other. Donald Trump and his people may not fully understand how strong the Russian position is on Ukraine, though I think they're gradually coming to see that. But as for the position of the Europeans, yes, the Europeans will complain. They will get increasingly angry. But events are now moving in their own direction. increasingly the people of Europe are not with their leaders. And frankly, I don't think Trump needs to worry about them. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.